The Quarterly, the Book of Isaiah, Lesson 7, Isaiah 35, A Highway Homeward. Isaiah 34 and 35 form the climax of chapters 1 through 35, the judgment-focused section of the book. After these chapters comes the historical interlude of chapters 36 to 39, which describe Jerusalem's deliverance from the Assyrians under Sennacherib in 701 BC, 36 and 37, and then Hezekiah's healing from sickness in 38 to 39, after which words of hope predominate from chapter 40 onwards. These two chapters show us a tale of two countries with contrasting destinies, Edom in chapter 34 and Judah in chapter 35. As is often the case in the prophets, Edom is a representative of the world that is in opposition to the Lord. They may seem to be on the highway to success and prosperity, while the Lord's path for his own people looks dry and desolate as it winds through the wilderness. But appearances can be deceptive, as Malachi 1, 2 through 5 makes clear. Those who trust in the surrounding nations or in idols will end up in a desert place, as Edom does in Isaiah 34. Those who trust on the Lord, on the other hand, find that they have a solid hope for salvation. As so often in the book of Isaiah, the hope of salvation is more specifically the hope of restoration on the other side of judgment, something that Edom could never hope for. The Lord comes to redeem his people, whose sins had brought them into bondage. He comes to strengthen the weary, to encourage the faint-hearted, to heal the sick, to bring fruitfulness to the barren desert. Even those who've turned away from the Lord and begun to wander like lost sheep or wicked fools will be brought home again in the arms of the great shepherd. The Lord will make a way for them in the desert, so that they may return again to their own land, and more importantly, may return to him. The returning exiles are not the only ones who rejoice at the prospect of going home after their time of exile in Babylon. Rather, all creation will burst forth with joy at the fulfillment of God's plan for his people. Chapter 35, verse 1. The restoration of God's people means nothing less than the approach of the promised new creation, with all of the frustrations that were brought about by the fall being removed from both man and beast. Romans 8, 20 to 23. When the Lord brings back his people, the dry and desert areas of the wilderness will burst into blossom, like the desert after it receives a much-needed rainfall, in verse 2. Indeed, these despised and barren regions will attain the glory of the wooded regions of Lebanon and Carmel and Sharon, with their rich forests of tall cedars, the classic symbols of abundance. This forms a sharp contrast to the previously fruitful land of Edom, which had been turned into a desolate wilderness in chapter 34. Trusting in human power and strength makes a fruitful land barren, but trusting in the Lord can make a barren land fruitful. But the real glory in this story belongs to the Lord, not to the most attractive and fruitful places on earth. The desert does not merely represent a particular geographical location in the Middle East. Rather, it stands for everything that human pride has destroyed and made barren from the time of Adam and Eve onward. The Lord declares his power to restore this broken world to abundant fruitfulness. This beautiful vision serves a similar function to the glossy pictures of sunny beaches that grace travel websites every February. It's designed to encourage the weary to keep on trusting and hoping that the winter will soon be past, and the springtime of God's favor will soon arrive. Therefore, they should strengthen the weak, perhaps drooping hands, and stiffen their feeble knees, verse 3. The issue being addressed here is not merely weariness, but debilitating fear, as can be seen from passages like Ezekiel 7:14 to 18. Weakness in the hands and knees is commonly cited in ancient Near Eastern accounts as the response of an ill-equipped land to the prospect of a coming invasion by an overwhelming force. In addition to steadying knees and hands, the prophet has a word to calm the racing heart. Be strong. Don't be afraid, for your king comes with fearful vengeance. Verse 4. In Isaiah 34:8, the message of the Lord coming with vengeance was not good news for Edom, since he was bringing his fearful wrath to bear against the enemies of his people. Now, however, he comes with power in order to deliver the exiles of Judah. The Lord is moving out for judgment and salvation, which is good news for weary exiles. The result of the Lord's coming means healing to the broken. There will be sight to the blind and hearing for the deaf. Verse 5. This blessing does not cover merely the physically affected, but the spiritually affected as well, reversing the curse of Isaiah 6:10. More broadly, the lame will leap and the tongue of the dumb will speak. Verse 6. These promised physical healings are signs pointing forward to the Lord's spiritual healing of his people. It's not coincidental that in Acts 3:8, the lame man healed at the temple by Peter and John goes on his way walking and leaping and praising God. Likewise, when John the Baptist's disciples come to Jesus asking if he is the promised Messiah, he points them to his healing miracles, including specifically healing the blind, the lame, and the deaf. Luke 7:20 to 22. In Jesus, Isaiah's prophecy finds its fulfillment. Meanwhile, the end of this section returns to the beginning, with the provision of water in the desert and life-giving streams in the wilderness. Verses 6 and 7. In John 7:37 and 38, Jesus stands up and proclaims that this promise is also fulfilled in him. Anyone who believes in him will have rivers of living water flow from him to slake the thirst of this parched world. Contrast with the fate of Edom in the previous chapter is sharp. Their land will become the haunt of jackals. 34:13. While for God's people, what was the haunt of jackals will be transformed into a place of rich grazing land. 35:7. And to facilitate the return of the exiles to God's land, the Lord will engineer a highway in the wilderness and will call it the way of holiness. Verse 8. This pathway will not be for the unclean, who would defile it by their presence. Verse 8. Even fools, whose natural tendency is to go astray, will be able to travel it safely, kept on the straight and narrow by God's leading. There will be no dangerous animals to threaten the redeemed on their homeward journey. Wild animals were a common danger when traveling in lonely and isolated areas of Israel during this time, but they were also a sign of covenant curse. Leviticus 26:22. In chapter 34, it's a sign of the Lord's judgments. The previously habitable areas of Edom have now become overrun by wild animals. 34:13 to 15. But no such dangers will prevent the ransomed ones of the Lord from returning safely. They will come back to Zion with joy and with gladness, while the sorrow and sighing that express their former emotional state will flee away. Verse 10. These last two verbs are actually military terms. Literally, it says that gladness and joy will overtake them, hunting them down like an avenging army, while sorrow and sighing will flee away like a defeated enemy. The highway thus combines the image of a safe route back from their time in exile with that of a safe pilgrimage up to Zion for one of the annual festivals. The joy that the faithful attain on their arrival in Zion is not temporary and fleeting, but solid and everlasting. Verse 10. In that day they will truly have come home. The two Hebrew words translated redeemed and ransomed often appear as synonyms in the Old Testament. Both describe God's deliverance of Israel from Egypt, and they thus depict this future return of God's people from exile as being a new exodus, bringing them safely back to the land that the Lord promised to give to their forefathers, and now will give once again to them. Application questions. 1. What situations in life do you think this passage is designed to address? 2. How does this passage challenge us during those specific kinds of times of life? 3. How does it encourage and strengthen us in those same times? 4. How does the coming of Jesus deepen and enrich the meaning of this passage?